The key was old. That was the first thing Margaret noticed. The weight of it, heavier than it had any right to be for something so small, its iron barrel tarnished to the color of a winter sky just before snow. She held it in her palm on the front porch of the house where she had grown up, and for a long moment she simply stood there, 64 years old, with 2 suitcases behind her and nothing in front of her but a locked door and a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat. She had lost nearly everything that morning. Not in the dramatic way you might imagine. No screaming, no shattered dishes, no final confrontation in a doorway. It had happened in a lawyer's beige office on the 16th floor of a building in downtown Richmond, Virginia, with the air conditioning set too cold and a water pitcher no one touched sitting in the center of a conference table like a prop in a stage play. 38 years of her life had been distributed, allocated, and signed away in 97 minutes. She knew because she had counted. She had watched the clock on the wall because looking at Gerald, at the careful way he avoided her eyes, at the small triumphant smile that flickered at the corner of his mouth each time his attorney scored a point, would have broken something inside her that she was not prepared to lose. She was left with her personal effects, her car, and a single-page settlement that her own attorney had called, with professional understatement, disappointing. The house they had built together in the River District, gone. The investment accounts she had helped manage through 2 recessions, gone. The weekend property in the Blue Ridge, gone. She received a modest sum, enough for a year if she was careful, and a future as blank and cold as the January afternoon outside the lawyer's window. And then, in the parking garage, before she could even find her car, a call had come from a number she didn't recognize. A woman's voice, dry and formal, identifying herself as an attorney from Charlottesville named Ruth Hensley. Ms. Whitfield, she had said, using her maiden name, which Maggie hadn't been called in 4 decades, there is a matter concerning your father's estate that requires your attention. In person. As soon as possible. Her father, Harold Whitfield, had been dead for 6 weeks. And he had left her a key. Just a key. Old, heavy, the color of a winter sky. And no one, not Gerald, not his attorneys, not her daughter Laura who had sat on Gerald's side of the table through every session of mediation, no one knew what it opened. That is the question this story answers. And once you hear the answer, you will understand that what happened in that beige office on that cold January morning was not the end of Margaret Calloway's life. It was the beginning of something her father had been building for her in secret for 30 years. Stay with me. Before we go any further, if you've ever watched someone you love be diminished, dismissed, or simply erased after a lifetime of giving, then this channel was built for you. We tell the stories that matter about the people who endure. Subscribe now and stay close. Because the key Margaret is holding in her hand, what it opens will change everything you thought you understood about this story. And you will want to see it. To understand what Margaret lost, you must first understand what she built. Because the tragedy of her story is not simply that she was left. The tragedy is the magnitude of what she had given, measured against the nothing she was handed in return. Margaret Eleanor Whitfield was born in the summer of 1960 in Crozet, Virginia, a small town nestled at the foot of the Blue Ridge Mountains where the air smelled of apples in August and the neighbors knew your name and your grandmother's name and your grandmother's maiden name before that. Her father Harold was a quiet man, a civil engineer by training, a tinkerer by temperament, a reader of books and a watcher of things. He built their house himself on 4 acres of land that had been in the Whitfield family since before either World War, and he filled it with a kind of unhurried order, tools hung in exactly their places in the barn, the kitchen garden replanted every April without fail, the books on his shelves organized not by title or author but by year he had first read them, a system that made sense only to him but that he could navigate in the dark. Her mother, Alice, died when Maggie was 11, and after that it was just the 2 of them, Harold and his daughter, quiet companions moving through the seasons of the farm, learning to speak in the language of shared tasks rather than words. He never remarried. He told Maggie once, when she was perhaps 15, that some things could not be replaced, only honored. She had not understood it fully then. She understood it completely now. She met Gerald Calloway at the University of Virginia in the autumn of 1979. She was 19. He was 22, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once doubted that the world would arrange itself to suit him, and in Maggie's experience at that age, such men were irresistible. He was funny in the particular way that charming, slightly careless people are funny, effortlessly, at the expense of whatever happened to be nearby, always sure of his audience. He noticed her across a library reading room. She was studying for her architecture finals, and he sat down across from her and said, without preamble, "You look like you're trying to will that textbook into ash. What do you know about engineering stress loads?" She had told him more than he expected. He had come back the following day. By December they were inseparable. She dropped her architecture program at the end of her second year. Gerald had an opportunity, a junior partnership at a development firm in Richmond that required a move, and the move required a decision, and the decision was made in the way that many decisions were made in those years, with the unspoken understanding that his trajectory was the operative one. She told herself it wasn't a sacrifice. She was 21 and in love, and Richmond was only 2 hours from Crozet, and she could always go back to finish the degree later, couldn't she? Of course she could. There was no hurry. There was always a reason why later hadn't arrived yet. They married in June of 1982, in the garden of Harold's farm, under the oak tree that had stood in the yard since before the Civil War. Harold walked her down the makeshift aisle between white garden chairs with a quiet pride that made her throat ache, and when he took Gerald's hand at the altar his grip lasted just a half-second longer than was customary. She had noticed it at the time and attributed it to emotion, to a father's reluctance to let go. Later, she would reconsider what that grip had meant. The years that followed were full in the way that absorbs a person completely. 2 children, Laura born in 1987 and Thomas in 1990, a sequence of houses as Gerald's business grew, school runs and soccer Saturdays, and the particular exhaustion of being the operational center of a family while your husband operated in the executive tier just above the daily machinery. She did not resent it, not then, not for a long time. She had chosen it. She had remade herself around it. She learned Gerald's preferences with the thoroughness of someone studying for an examination that never ended. The way he took his coffee in the morning, black, no sugar, the mug pre-warmed. The topics he preferred not to discuss in social settings. His father, money in concrete terms, anything that made him feel uninformed, the precise temperature of the house that allowed him to sleep. She became expert in the invisible labor of his comfort and called it love, because for a long time, she believed it was. Gerald Callaway Properties grew from a mid-sized Richmond firm into a regional developer of some significance through the 1990s and 2000s, and Gerald grew with it, broader in the shoulders and the ego both, acquiring the manner of a man who had learned that most rooms would reorient themselves around his presence if he simply entered with enough certainty. He was generous to clients, magnetic at dinner parties, gracious in the receiving of compliments. He became, in certain Richmond social circles, a man of consequence. And Maggie, elegant, composed, always perfectly prepared, was the silent architecture of every success he stood in front of, the invisible load-bearing wall that allowed the whole structure to remain upright. She visited her father in Crozet as often as she could manage, and on those visits she felt, always, a subtle readjustment occurring inside her, like a compass needle finding north. Harold was older now, moving more slowly through his rooms, but still meticulous, still present, still watching things with that particular stillness that she had absorbed through childhood and could not name. On one of those visits, she was 47, Thomas had just started college. She had sat with him at the kitchen table and said, in a moment of unusual candor, "Dad, do you like Gerald?" Harold had turned his coffee mug slowly in his hands, looking at it rather than her, and said, "I think Gerald is a man who has never had to lose anything. And I think that kind of man is dangerous when the bill finally comes." She had changed the subject. She had driven back to Richmond with his words sitting in her chest like a stone she couldn't locate. The first sign came in 2017. She was 57. She found a text message, not by snooping, nothing so dramatic. It appeared on the kitchen counter when Gerald left his phone face up while he took a shower, and the name at the top of the thread was a woman's name, Diane, and the content of the message was brief but irrefutably clear. She stood with a dish towel in her hands and read it once. Replaced the phone exactly where it had been. Finish drying the glass she was holding. Open the cabinet and set the glass inside. And then she stood alone in her kitchen of 22 years and understood that the bill had come. She did not confront him immediately. She is not sure, even now, why she waited, whether it was the particular paralysis that falls over you when you have organized your entire life around one thing and that thing suddenly fails to be true, or whether it was a deeper, almost animal instinct that told her to be still, to watch, to understand the full dimensions of what she was facing before she moved. She waited 3 weeks. She gathered information with the same quiet thoroughness she had applied to everything else in her marriage, and what she gathered confirmed what the text message had implied. Gerald had been seeing Diane Reese, a 41-year-old marketing consultant who worked with one of his development partners, for nearly 2 years. 2 years. 104 weeks. The duration pressed against her ribs with a physical weight. She asked him, finally, on a Tuesday evening in October. She set the table for dinner as she always did, lit the candles that she always lit, poured the wine, and then she sat down across from him and said his name in a tone that made him look up from his phone for the first time all evening. She told him what she knew. She did not raise her voice. She did not, in fact, move. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and she watched his face perform its sequence of expressions: surprise, calculation, the brief assessment of how much she knew versus how much he could salvage, and then he set down his fork and said, "Maggie, I think we've been unhappy for a long time and we both know it." That sentence, that specific reordering of reality, in which his infidelity became their mutual decline, in which her pain became a shared condition, in which she was made complicit in the very thing that was being done to her, that was the first of the cruelties. It would not be the last. He moved out within the month. The divorce proceedings began in January 2018 and lasted, in their various stages of negotiation and mediation and bitter procedural delay, for nearly 3 years. Gerald hired Harrison Polk, the best matrimonial attorney in the state of Virginia, a man famous for his ability to restructure marital assets in the months leading up to a divorce filing, to create legal entities and strategic transfers that were individually defensible and collectively devastating. Maggie had her own attorney, a competent woman named Patricia Wells who fought hard for her but who was, in the end, outgunned and outfinanced. Gerald had spent 38 years building a fortress of incorporated entities, holding companies, and limited partnerships, and the Callaway family assets that existed on paper were a remarkably different landscape from the Callaway family assets that existed in reality. She lost the house. The 4-bedroom colonial in the River District where she had raised her children, where Laura had come home from prom and Thomas had recovered from a broken arm, where she had painted the kitchen yellow on a Thursday in 2003 and stayed up until 2 in the morning because she had committed and it seemed important to finish. She lost it to a holding company that Gerald had restructured 18 months before the divorce filing. Technically, the house did not belong to them, it belonged to a company. The judge acknowledged the timing was unfortunate. He awarded her a cash settlement instead. It was a fraction of the home's market value. She lost the investment accounts, or most of them, transferred, restructured, reclassified. She lost the Blue Ridge property. She lost the art they had collected over 30 years, reassigned through a series of entity transfers that Patricia could challenge but not overturn. What she kept, her personal belongings, her car, a sum of money, and a future that felt less like a horizon and more like a wall. But the loss that carved the deepest wound was not financial. It was Laura. Her daughter, 38 years old, a corporate attorney herself, sharp and capable and raised by Maggie's own hands, had aligned herself with her father in a way that could not be explained entirely by legal strategy or professional self-interest. Laura had appeared at mediation sessions on Gerald's behalf, had provided testimony that reframed Maggie's years of household management as personal choice rather than marital contribution, had used her legal training to describe her own mother's decades of devotion in the language of voluntary election. She had looked at Maggie across the conference table on the second day of mediation and said, with a composure that was more devastating than anger would have been, "Mom, you had every opportunity to go back to school or build a career. Dad supported that. You chose this." The room had gone very quiet. Patricia had placed a hand briefly on Maggie's arm under the table. Maggie had looked at her daughter, at the set of her jaw that was Gerald's jaw, at the eyes that were Maggie's own eyes, and she had thought, I made you. I stayed up through your fevers. I drove you to every audition and every tournament. I rearranged my every ambition around your becoming. And she had said none of it aloud. She had nodded slowly and turned her eyes back to the document in front of her. She signed the settlement on the 15th of January, 2021. She was 60 years old. Gerald shook his attorney's hand with the satisfaction of a man concluding a successful transaction. He looked at Maggie once before he left the room, a glance that contained something she was surprised to identify in its aftermath, not as malice but as relief, as though she were a debt he had finally discharged, and then he walked out the door with Harrison Polk and disappeared down the corridor, the sound of their conversation growing smaller and finally gone. She sat alone in the conference room for 4 minutes. She knew because she watched the clock. Then she gathered her papers, put on her coat, and took the elevator down to the parking garage, and it was there, in that concrete dark that smelled of engine oil and cold air, that her phone rang and the attorney from Charlottesville said, Ms. Whitfield, there is a matter concerning your father's estate that requires your attention. 6 weeks earlier, Harold Whitfield had died in the house he built himself, in the bed where he had slept for 50 years, with his books around him and his tools in the barn and his garden waiting under its winter cover of straw for the April that he would not see. He had been 86 years old. He had been, by every external measure, a quiet man of modest means. He had never once suggested otherwise. Ruth Hensley had been his attorney for 31 years. She drove the 2 hours to Crozet the following morning, in the dark of a January pre-dawn that pressed against the windshield like a held breath. She had not slept. She had sat in her hotel room, she was staying in hotels now, a fact she had not yet fully processed, and stared at the ceiling with the key on the nightstand beside her, its weight still inexplicable, its purpose still unknown. Ruth Hensley had told her almost nothing on the phone, only that there was paperwork to discuss, and that she should come prepared to spend several hours, and that she should bring the key if she had received it in her father's personal effects. Maggie had received it. It had been the only non-obvious item in the small cedar box that the hospice staff had returned to her, his watch, his wedding ring, a photograph of Maggie's mother from 1958, and the key, lying in the bottom of the box on a small paper tag that read, in Harold's careful block letters, for when you need it. The drive took her west out of Richmond along Route 64, into the foothills where the land began to swell and rise, the Blue Ridge assembling itself out of the darkness as the sky lightened from black to the particular bruised purple of a Virginia winter dawn. She had always loved this drive, even now, even with the cold tendrils of fear coiling quietly through her chest and the future being so formless she could not hold its shape in her mind. The mountains steadied her. They were, she thought, the oldest things she knew. They had been here through everything. She passed the Waynesboro exit and began the familiar winding descent toward Crozet, and here the landscape arranged itself in memory as well as geography, the orchard on the left that flooded every spring, the white farmhouse with the red silo that had stood unchanged since her childhood, the stand of white oaks along the creek bottom where she had once collected maple seeds and released them into the wind, spinning and falling, the whole afternoon golden and small and entirely sufficient. She was crying before she realized it, not from sadness, precisely, or not only from sadness, but from the particular grief of returning to a place that contains a version of yourself you thought you'd had to leave behind. She turned onto Whitfield Road, named not for her family but the coincidence had always pleased Harold quietly, and the gravel crackled under her tires in the familiar way, and then the farmhouse appeared through the bare winter trees. White clapboard, green shutters, the oak tree still standing in the yard with its massive arms outstretched as though offering something. She sat in the driveway for a moment after the engine went quiet. The cold was immediate and total when she opened the door, the kind of clean rural cold that the city doesn't produce, carrying a smell of frozen earth and wood smoke from somewhere. She stood by her car and looked at the house and felt something she had not expected, not grief, but recognition. Not loss, but arrival. The house had been empty for the 6 weeks since Harold's death, and it showed the particular dignity of a well-kept thing resting. No neglect, no disorder, just stillness. Maggie walked to the front porch and climbed the 3 steps she had climbed 10,000 times, and she stood before the front door, and she took the key from her coat pocket. It slid into the lock as though it had been waiting. The mechanism turned with a sound that was less like opening and more like something exhaling. The interior was cold but held the ghost of Harold's warmth. His reading chair by the window, his stack of books on the side table, his coffee mug still on the kitchen counter as though he had only just stepped out to the barn. She set her bag down and walked through the rooms slowly, touching things: the worn arm of the chair, the spine of a book, the smooth edge of the kitchen table he had built himself in 1971 with lumber from the farm. She opened the back door and stood looking at the garden under its winter straw, at the barn beyond it, at the 4 acres of land sloping gently toward the creek, the fields bisected by an old stone wall that Harold had repointed every 5 years with the patient stubbornness of a man making a permanent statement. She had not yet gone to the barn. Something her father had said to her once, years ago, she couldn't place when, drifted through her mind. The thing about a good plan, Maggie girl, is that it doesn't announce itself. It just waits. She had smiled at the time. She had thought he was talking about gardening. Ruth Hensley's office was on Main Street in Charlottesville, 20 minutes east, and her appointment was at 10. She had 2 hours. She made coffee in her father's kitchen with his coffee and his mug and stood at his window watching the light strengthen across the winter fields, and she let herself simply be still. Just for a little while. Still and present, and in the place where she had once been whole. She did not yet know that her father had spent the last 30 years of his life building something extraordinary. She would know in 2 hours. Ruth Hensley was a small, precisely assembled woman in her 60s with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she had the manner of someone who has been trusted with serious things for so long that seriousness had become her natural element. Her office was lined floor to ceiling with books and files, and it smelled of paper and lemon oil and something faintly like permanence. She met Maggie at the door rather than waiting for her to be shown in, and she shook her hand with both of hers and said, "I'm glad you're here, Margaret. Your father was very clear about wanting this handled in person." She offered coffee and Maggie accepted, and they sat across from each other at the wide desk and Ruth opened a file that was, Maggie noted, considerably thicker than she had expected. "Before we begin," Ruth said, "I want to tell you something. I've been practicing for 41 years. I've handled thousands of estates. What your father built, what he asked me to help him build, piece by piece, over 3 decades, is the most deliberate thing I have ever been part of. He was a remarkable man. And he loved you in a way that most people don't know how to express. This is how he expressed it." Maggie's hands tightened slightly in her lap. Ruth opened the file. She began with the property. The farmhouse and the 4 acres were straightforward. Harold had left them to Maggie outright, free of any mortgage or encumbrance. But that, Ruth said, was the smallest part. 11 years earlier, in 2010, Harold had quietly acquired the adjacent 42 acres when the Pierce family farm came up for sale. He had purchased them through a limited liability company named, with characteristic Harold understatement, Whitfield Land Holdings LLC. The transaction had been unremarkable enough that it attracted no attention. 42 acres of Blue Ridge foothill farmland, with creek frontage, 2 outbuildings, and soil that had not been commercially farmed in 20 years. At 2010 prices, it had cost him a significant portion of his savings. In 2021, that same land appraised at $2.1 million. LC, Ruth continued, had a single member. That member was Margaret Eleanor Whitfield. Not Margaret Calloway. Margaret Whitfield. Her maiden name. The name she had not used in 38 years. Ruth let that settle for a moment. Then she continued. In 2003, Harold had begun investing, not through a broker, not through the financial instruments that Gerald would have recognized and known to watch, but through a series of real estate investment trusts and private equity positions that Ruth had helped him structure, always in the name of Whitfield Land Holdings, always in Maggie's maiden name. He had invested methodically, at intervals, never dramatically. He had never mentioned it to anyone. He had, Ruth said, a degree of patience that she had found almost supernatural. He reinvested every distribution. He made no withdrawals. He treated the whole enterprise as though it were a garden, planted, tended, and not to be disturbed before its time. The total value of the investment holdings as of January 2021 was $4.3 million. Combined with the property, the total estate was valued at just over $6.4 million, held entirely within an irrevocable trust, specifically structured to be unreachable by any claim arising from Maggie's marriage to Gerald Calloway, established and registered a full 2 decades before the divorce, bulletproof in its legal architecture, untouchable by any instrument Harrison Polk might have deployed. Gerald had known nothing. For 30 years, the man who had dismissed Harold Whitfield as an aging country civil engineer with a small farm and a reading chair had been sitting, unknowingly, across the table from a woman who was the sole beneficiary of a fortune her father had been quietly building in her name since before her children were born. He saw it coming, didn't he? Maggie said. It was not quite a question. Ruth removed her glasses and set them on the desk. He told me, she said carefully, that he didn't trust Gerald's stability. Not from the beginning. He said, and I wrote this down because it struck me, he said, a man who never loses anything grows convinced the rules don't apply to him. Eventually he proves it. She paused. He began the first investment 18 months after your wedding. He said he hoped he was wrong about Gerald. But he prepared as though he was right. Maggie sat very still. Outside Ruth's window, Charlottesville moved through its January morning with no knowledge of what was happening in this room. Traffic, coffee cups, ordinary lives going about their business. Inside, something was shifting that had taken 3 decades to shift, the tectonic plates of a story that Maggie had believed she knew the shape of, rearranging themselves into an entirely different landscape. She had thought she was a woman who had lost everything. She was, in fact, a woman who had been protected, quietly, deliberately, lovingly, from the moment her father had shaken Gerald Calloway's hand at the altar and held on a half-second too long. There's one more thing, Ruth said. She reached into the file and withdrew a sealed envelope. It was the same size as a standard letter, and it was old. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, and the writing on the front was Harold's block printing in blue ink, for Margaret. To be opened when she needs it most. Ruth slid it across the desk without another word. Maggie held it for a long time. The paper had a texture that her fingers recognized before her memory did, the same stock her father had always used for correspondence, a cream-colored bond paper, slightly heavier than standard. She had seen him buy it at the stationery shop in Charlottesville 20 times. The seal was intact, the flap carefully pressed down. She could feel, through the paper, that there were several pages inside. She opened it. The handwriting was Harold's, exact, unhurried, each letter formed with the precision of a man who did not believe in approximation. It was dated June 12, 2019, a year and a half before his death, the summer Maggie had visited and sat with him on the porch in the evenings, listening to the whippoorwills, neither of them speaking much. He had seemed particularly content that summer. She had attributed it to the warmth, to the fullness of the garden, to old age settling into its own comfort. Now she understood he had recently updated and finalized everything and was simply waiting in his way. She read, "My Maggie girl, if you are reading this, then the thing I hoped would not happen has happened, and I am sorry for that. Not sorry I prepared for it, but sorry you had to arrive at the place where preparation becomes necessary. I know what that place feels like. I know how much it costs. I want to explain a few things, because you deserve the explanation even if the outcome can speak for itself. I knew Gerald was not right for you from the first time I met him. I want to be fair. He was not a bad man in the way that truly bad men are bad. He was something perhaps harder to name, a man who had organized his understanding of the world around the idea that he was its center of gravity and that everything and everyone near him existed primarily in relation to his orbit. I recognized it because I had known men like him before, and I had seen what happens to the people who love them. I saw the way he looked at you, not at you, really, but at the reflection of himself in your admiration. I saw the way he spoke about your father, about this place, about your life before him, as though it were a rough draft and he were the final version. I said nothing. I walked you down the aisle. I shook his hand. Because you loved him, and because you were 21, and because the heart does not negotiate with reason, and I knew it, and I respected it even when it frightened me. But I began, the following spring, to build something. I want you to understand that this was not an act of cynicism. I did not do this because I believed your marriage was doomed from the start. I did it because I believed that love should not leave a woman with nothing if it ends, and because I believed that the best thing a father can give his daughter is not a path but a foundation, something solid to stand on when paths become unclear. I hoped you would never need it. I kept building it anyway. The land is yours, Maggie. The Pierce acres, the creek, the outbuildings, I bought them because I wanted you to have ground to stand on, literal ground, when everything else became unmoored. There is good water on that land and good soil, and the light in the late afternoon along that creek is the same light it was when you were 7 years old and you used to catch crawdads in a tin bucket and bring them to show me and then put them all back. I want you to know I remember that. I have always remembered that. The money in the trust is real and it is clean and it is yours. Ruth will explain the details. What I want you to understand is the spirit of it. This is not a rescue. It is not charity. It is what you were always owed. It is the value of 40 years of a woman who chose love and chose family and chose to believe the best about a man who did not always deserve it. The world failed to pay you for that work. I did the accounting myself. I have one more thing to tell you, and this is the part that will require you to sit quietly for a moment. In 1998, Gerald approached me about a partnership. He wanted access to the Whitfield land for a development project he was assembling, not this farm, but 3 adjacent parcels along the Route 250 corridor. He presented it very carefully and asked me to invest alongside him and offered me, in exchange, a right of first refusal on future projects. I declined the investment, but I agreed to the right of first refusal, and I had Ruth draw up an agreement. Gerald signed it without reading it carefully. He never read anything carefully when he was certain of the outcome. What that agreement contains, in language that Ruth will explain in full, is a clause that designates me, and my heirs, as a required notifying party for any development activity on the corridor parcels. It also contains, in an appendix that Gerald's attorney should have caught but did not, a covenant that restricts Gerald's ability to develop that corridor without my written permission, or the written permission of my estate. That corridor, Maggie, is where Gerald's largest current development project is being assembled. He has been building his financing for it for 3 years. Without your signature, he cannot proceed. I did not create this to be cruel. I created it because I understood, by 1998, exactly what kind of man your husband was, and I believed that a woman who had given her life to a man who did not value it deserved, at minimum, a moment of equilibrium. The choice of what to do with it is entirely yours. You owe him nothing, but you have options. Whatever you choose, choose it from a place of strength, not anger. Strength. You were always the best thing I ever did, my girl. Not because I made you, because you made yourself, and I was fortunate enough to watch. Your father, Harold. Maggie read the letter twice. Then she folded it along its original creases and held it flat in her hands, and she looked out Ruth Hensley's window at the January morning, and she felt the thing she had not expected to feel. She laughed. Not from joy, exactly, though joy was in it, but from the sheer, staggering, improbable absurdity of what her quiet father had built in the silence between his words, in the patient decades of his watching. She laughed until her eyes were streaming, and Ruth Hensley, to her credit, simply waited, her hands folded on the desk, allowing the laugh to run its full length. Then Maggie stopped. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. She looked at Ruth and said, "Tell me about the covenant." Ruth smiled, small, exact, entirely professional. She reached for the second folder in the stack. "I was hoping you'd ask," she said. He came to her door 9 days later. She had been expecting him, not precisely, not on a schedule, but with the settled certainty of someone who understands the shape of events once the underlying structure is revealed. Gerald's development project had, according to the information Ruth had discreetly provided, been in the final stages of financing assembly for months. 3 investors, a construction timeline, a groundbreaking announcement already drafted. When his attorneys had begun their due diligence, as they inevitably would and apparently had, only a matter of days after the estate was filed for probate and became discoverable, they would have found Harold's covenant. And Gerald, understanding with sudden crystalline clarity who Harold Whitfield had really been, would have done exactly what Maggie expected him to do. He knocked on the door of the farmhouse on a Thursday afternoon in late January, at 3:45, while Maggie was in the kitchen with her neighbor Dorothea Pierce, 72 years old, who had grown up on the adjacent farm and who had returned to the property to help Maggie air out the rooms and take stock of what needed doing. They had received Maggie's arrival with a matter-of-fact warmth that asked no questions and offered an ongoing stream of practical assistance and strong opinions about everything, and Maggie had found, over the preceding week, that Dot's particular brand of loving, unsentimental competence was among the most sustaining things she had encountered in months. The knock came and Maggie looked up from the plans she had spread on the table and said, "I'll get it," with a composure that surprised Dot into brief silence. She walked to the front door and opened it. Gerald stood on the porch in his winter coat, the good one, charcoal wool, the one he wore when he wanted to communicate substance. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before, not the ordinary fatigue of overwork but something deeper, the tired of a man who has recently discovered that his map of the territory was wrong in a fundamental way. He was holding his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. That was new. "Please, Gerald," she said. She did not step aside to let him in. Not yet. She let the moment hold, exactly as long as it needed to hold, and she watched him adjust his weight from one foot to the other and try to find the version of himself that worked best in this situation. The confident one, the conciliatory one, the reasonable one, and she watched each of them fail to arrive. "I'd like to come in, if that's all right," he said. "Of course," she said, and stepped aside. He came into the hallway and stopped. He looked around, at the house that had always been Harold's, that Gerald had visited perhaps 30 times in 38 years and treated, throughout, with the faint condescension of a man who has built grander things and cannot help comparing. She watched him look at it differently now. She watched him calculate. She led him to the front parlor, not the warm kitchen where Dot was. That room was not for this conversation. She sat in Harold's chair. She indicated the sofa across from it. He sat. "I've been speaking with my attorneys," he began. "I imagine you have," she said. "About your father's estate. About a covenant that appears to—" He stopped. Started again. "Maggie, I don't know if you understand the scope of what's at stake here. This development represents 3 years of work. 11 million in assembled financing. My partners." "Gerald," she said, quietly, not cutting him off, simply placing the word in the space his sentence had created. He stopped. "I know exactly what's at stake," she said. "My father made certain of that." Something moved behind his eyes. Assessment. Recalibration. He had come in expecting the Maggie he had always known. Accommodating, considered, ultimately deferential to the practical reality he presented. He was meeting, she suspected, someone he did not entirely recognize. He did this deliberately, Gerald said, and there was something in his voice, not quite accusation, more like a man who has realized he was in a different game than the one he thought he was playing, and is still catching up. "He did," she said. "He tied my hands. On a project he knew nothing about." "He knew a great deal more than you assumed he did," she said. "That was a miscalculation on your part. It was a consistent one." Gerald set his hat on the cushion beside him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and she recognized this posture, the one he used when he was being serious, when he wanted you to understand that the social niceties were being set aside and he was speaking to you as one adult to another. It had worked on her, in various versions, for 38 years. "I need your signature," he said, "on a waiver of the covenant. I need it in the next 30 days or the financing falls through. I will make it worth your while. Significantly worth your while. I'm prepared to make an offer." "Gerald," she said again. The same tone. The same placement. He stopped again. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I'd like you to take a moment and actually consider it, rather than preparing your response while I'm still speaking." He waited. "When you sat across from me in that conference room," she said, "when Harrison Polk was explaining to the judge why I was entitled to a fraction of the assets I helped build, did you feel anything?" He opened his mouth. "Actually consider it," she said. A long silence. A silence she did not fill. "I thought it was fair," he said at last. "I thought, you made choices, Maggie. We both made choices." She said, "We did." She stood. She moved to the small writing desk in the corner, where a file folder was waiting, placed there that morning, prepared under Ruth Hensley's guidance. She picked it up and turned and looked at him, and she said, "I've had Ruth review your project. The corridor development. The financing structure. The partnership agreements." She paused. "I'm aware that your primary financial partner withdrew 3 weeks ago. I'm aware that without the corridor parcels, the project cannot achieve the density necessary for the remaining investors to stay in. I'm aware that if this project fails, your firm's current debt-to-equity position will likely trigger a default review." Gerald's face had gone very still. "My father left me options," she said. "I've spent the last 9 days reviewing them. I've taken counsel. And I've made a decision." She opened the file folder and removed a single document and held it out across the coffee table. He reached for it with a hand that was not entirely steady. "That is a conditional waiver," she said. "My attorney has prepared it. It releases the covenant restriction on your corridor development in exchange for 3 things: a payment of $800,000 to the Whitfield Family Foundation, an educational trust 1M establishing in my father's name, paid within 90 days of project groundbreaking, a permanent easement granting public walking access along the eastern creek boundary of the corridor parcels, in perpetuity, and a formal, written acknowledgement, witnessed and notarized, that the marital settlement of January 2021 inadequately reflected my contribution to Callaway Properties over 38 years of marriage." Gerald had been reading the document. He looked up at the last item. "The third condition," he said. "That's not financial." That's accurate," she said. "It is a statement of fact. You may have your attorneys review the language. I have been reasonable with it. It does not assign blame, it does not make claims. It simply acknowledges what was." She sat back down in Harold's chair. "You told me in that conference room that I had made choices. You were right. I'm making another one now. I'm giving you a path forward. In my experience, that is more than you gave me." He sat with the document for a long time. She did not help him with the silence. She let it be his. Finally, Gerald folded the document in half and placed it in his coat pocket and picked up his hat from the cushion. He stood. He looked, in this moment, older than she had ever seen him look, not physically, necessarily, but in the way of a man who has arrived at a true understanding of his own dimensions and found them smaller than he had believed. "I'll have my attorneys review it," he said. "Of course," she said. She walked him to the door. They stood for a moment in the cold hallway and he turned once, briefly, and she saw something cross his face that she could not name, some complicated layering of regret and pride and the particular grief of a man realizing that the most extraordinary person he had ever known was no longer his, and had not, in some fundamental sense, ever entirely been. He did not say anything. He went out the door and down the 3 porch steps and along the gravel path to his car, and she stood in the doorway and watched him go, and she felt not triumph. Triumph was not the word, but the warm, settling sensation of a thing that had needed to be straight finally being straight. She went back to the kitchen. Dot was standing at the counter with 2 mugs of fresh coffee and an expression that communicated everything and required nothing. She handed Maggie a mug. She did not ask. They drank their coffee and looked out the window at the winter fields, and after a while Dot said, "Well," said Maggie. By April, the garden was in. Maggie had replanted it herself, on her knees in the cold mud of a March morning with her father's seed box open beside her, following the notes he had kept in his small spiral notebook for 30 years, when to plant the tomatoes, how far apart the bean rows, which beds needed amendment, where the asparagus had been established and should not be disturbed. The notebook was a document of extraordinary particularity, and reading it felt, at times, like a long conversation with her father conducted across the silence of his absence. She planted what he had always planted. She added a few things of her own. Gerald's attorneys had reviewed the conditional waiver and returned with 2 proposed modifications, both of which Ruth Hensley had rejected. After a further exchange of correspondence, Gerald had signed the original document. The $800,000 commitment was formalized, tied to the construction milestone, legally binding. The easement was recorded. The notarized acknowledgement sat in Ruth's files, witnessed by 2 attorneys and a notary, a legal document that said, in the measured language of the law, The contributions of Margaret Eleanor Whitfield to Callaway Properties and to the Callaway household over the period 1982 through 2021 were substantial and material, and the marital settlement of January 15, 2021 did not fully reflect their value. It would never be read by the general public. It would never appear in a newspaper. But it existed. And its existence meant, to Maggie, something that no dollar amount could have purchased. Laura had called in February. The conversation had been brief and careful, two women speaking across a distance that had geography in it but was not entirely geographic. Laura had said, with the particular precision of someone who has been rehearsing, "I think I made decisions during the divorce that I understood in legal terms but maybe not in other terms." And Maggie had said, "I know you did. And I think you were trying to protect something. I think you made the best decision you knew how to make." There was a silence, and then Laura said, "Can I come and see the farm?" Maggie had said, "Come in April, when the garden is in. I'll have the east bedroom ready." Thomas had been there already, had arrived the week after Maggie, driven down from D.C. without announcement one Saturday morning, appeared on the porch with a box of groceries and his sleeves rolled up, and spent 3 days cleaning gutters and repointing the porch steps and not talking about anything difficult. On his last evening he had sat with Maggie at the kitchen table and said, with the directness that had always been his particular quality, "Dad knows he was wrong, Mum. He's not capable of saying it like that yet. But he knows." She had put her hand over his. She had said, "It doesn't matter now, love." And she had meant it. The Whitfield Family Educational Foundation had been registered in March, named for Harold and dedicated to supporting women over 50 pursuing formal education, the exact path that Maggie herself had not taken at 21, being offered now to women at the moment she had been in, standing at a fork with insufficient resources to choose. Ruth had helped with the incorporation. The structure was clean and appropriate. The first round of grants would be allocated within the year. When Maggie told Dot about it over coffee, Dot had looked at her across the table with steady gray eyes and said, "That's Harold, all right. Putting your money where your meaning is." By May, the Pierce acreage, the 42 acres her father had quietly purchased 11 years ago, had been assessed by a landscape architect and a sustainable agriculture consultant Maggie had engaged through a contact at the University of Virginia. The land was extraordinary, rolling, creek-fed, the soil rich beneath its years of fallow rest, with natural wind breaks along the north border and a southern exposure ideal for growing. The architect's assessment had included, almost as an aside, a note that the 2 outbuildings on the property were structurally sound and could be converted to residential accommodation at modest cost, and that the site had the makings of what the assessment called, with professional understatement, an exceptional retreat facility. Maggie had circled that phrase in pencil and put the document on the kitchen table and looked at it for 3 evenings while she ate her dinner, and on the 4th evening she had picked up the phone and called a woman she had known in Richmond, a therapist named Carol who specialized in life transitions, and she had said, "I have a thought about something. I need someone smart to tell me if it's possible." It was possible. The retreat was named, eventually after nothing grand, just the address, Ridge Road, because Harold had taught her that a name should be honest about what it was, not inflated about what it hoped to become. Ridge Road Retreat, for women navigating transition. The first program would open in September, 2 weeks, 12 women, the farmhouse and the converted outbuildings, a schedule that balanced structured sessions with long walks along the creek and evenings on the porch with whatever the light was doing. Maggie would not run the therapy, that was Carol's domain, but she would run everything else. The cooking, the garden, the morning ritual she had begun herself of rising before light and sitting on the porch with her coffee until the fields became visible, watching the day declare itself. She was 61 years old. She owned 46 acres of Blue Ridge farmland and a house full of her father's books and a key on the kitchen windowsill that she had not put away, the same key, old and heavy, the color of a winter sky, because she liked what it had come to mean to her. Not just what it opened. The fact that her father had pressed it into her life at the exact moment she needed it. The fact that it had been waiting, patient and heavy, in the bottom of a cedar box, for the day she arrived at a locked door and needed a way through. She had thought, on that January morning, that her story was ending. A woman stripped of her home and her 38 years and her daughter's loyalty and her own sense of the ground beneath her feet, standing on a cold porch with nothing but a key and a question. She had thought she was at the bottom of a fall. She was, in fact, standing at the top of a staircase her father had been building in the dark for 30 years, one careful step at a time, in a house she had grown up in, on ground that had always been hers. She just hadn't known yet where it led. On the first warm evening in May, Maggie sat on the front porch in Harold's chair. She had moved it outside for the season, as he had always done, and she looked at the oak tree in the yard, the one that had stood since before the Civil War, whose roots went so far down into the earth that no storm in 2 centuries had moved it, and she thought about what endurance actually is. Not the white-knuckle variety, not the grinding performance of surviving while secretly falling apart. The other kind. The kind that looks like stillness but is actually deep work. The daily, unseen, unannounced act of putting down roots in darkness and trusting that spring comes. Her father had known. He had shown her, in the only way he knew how to show her, not through words but through 30 years of patient action, through a deed and a covenant and a letter kept in a cream-colored envelope in a filing cabinet in Charlottesville until the day she needed it. He had known what it felt like to have the ground disappear. He had spent a lifetime making sure that when the ground disappeared beneath his daughter's feet, there would be something solid waiting below. She thought. What I thought was an ending was the first word of a sentence he had been writing for decades. And then she set her coffee down on the arm of the chair and listened to the evening, the creek below the hill, the owls beginning in the wood lot, the soft settling of the farm into its own night, and she was at peace. Margaret Calloway walked into a lawyer's office with nothing. She walked out with a key she didn't understand, a phone call she hadn't expected, and a father's voice reaching across the silence of death to say, "I saw this coming. I prepared." And every morning as she walks through those 46 acres and watches the light come down through the Blue Ridge and settle over the fields her father bought for her while she was still believing in a marriage that was slowly failing her, every morning, she understands that love doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it is quiet and methodical and building in the background, one careful brick at a time, for 30 years. Sometimes it is a key in the bottom of a cedar box and a letter waiting in a cream-colored envelope and 46 acres of ground to stand on. Before you go, if this story touched something in you, I want to ask you to do one thing. Leave a single word in the comments below. Not a sentence, not an explanation, just one word. The word that describes the moment you realized you were stronger than what was trying to break you. Whether it came from a divorce, a loss, a dismissal, a year that tried to take everything, one word for the moment you knew you were still standing. This space is for the people who keep going quietly. Leave your word. Someone who needs it will find it. If you know a woman, a mother, a sister, a friend, anyone, who is in the middle of a hard season right now, who woke up recently and couldn't quite recognize the life she was standing in, share this story with her. Not as advice. Not as instruction. Just as a hand on the shoulder that says, someone built something for you. And you may not know it yet, but it is waiting. And to everyone who has been here for a while, this is what this channel is, and what it always will be. Stories about the people who endure. Stories that know the difference between a quiet strength and a loud performance. Stories that understand that the most extraordinary reversals are often the ones that no one saw coming because they were built in the silence of an ordinary life, one patient act at a time. If that is the kind of story you need, stay. Subscribe. Because the next one is already waiting, and you will want to be here when it begins.